Today's session is going to cover an overview of American society. This class is going to look at social problems primarily as they occur in the United States. So, with that in mind, it's going to be useful for us to sort of have a fairly clear understanding of the United States and some of its features and some of its descriptive elements and some of the themes kind of related to that might be important for us. So let's start with some insights that will guide an understanding of American society. Just to start out, understanding any society reflects a basic premise, and the basic premise is that if human actions are governed by rules, then understanding the rules allows us to understand how society works. This is a core assumption of a feature of science, an assumption in science that we call philosophical naturalism. Philosophical naturalism is the assumption that the world that we live in is governed by principles that operate consistently. More often than not, this is applied to the physical world, but it also applies to the social world, albeit in a sort of different fashion. Where in the physical world, the principles of physics, the principles of biology, the principles of geology, and all of that operate consistently. In the social world, the patterns, the regularly recurring features of society are things that exist at the level of society, but not necessarily at the level of an individual member of that society. This is kind of part and parcel of what Durkheim talks about when he discusses social facts, right? Social facts are things that are true of a society, even though they may not be true of a given representative member of that society. So you pull some random person out of American society, and they might not be religious, but American society is a religious society, right? So we look at the pattern that exists at the level of society, not at the individual level data of a specific individual, because there is no real way of knowing whether that person is typical of the pattern that we find at the level of society. But when we step back and we look at that aggregate, when we look at the large whole that is the entirety of the United States, we can see patterns. We can see processes that operate consistently. And if we understand the rules that govern those processes and that govern how that society operates, then it becomes really easy to engage in an analysis of that society, because the idea is that the rules are going to operate consistently. So what do we need to know about rules? Well, I would say that there are 6 basic aspects of rules that we need to kind of keep in mind. The first is that rules are enforced. What that means is they are connected to some mechanism of enforcement. It could be laws at the level of a municipality or a state or the nation. It could be policies that exist within the structure of an organization. But the idea here is that when there are rules, those rules are linked to some mechanism of enforcement. The second aspect of rules to keep in mind is that they take different forms. As I mentioned, they could take the form of laws. They could also take the form of social norms. Regardless of whether they are laws or norms, they are rules. Differing levels of seriousness, different mechanisms of enforcement, different consequences for violation, but rules nevertheless. The third thing to keep in mind about rules is that they are often not neutral. Laws benefit some people at the expense of others. Rules benefit some people at the expense of others. Norms benefit some people at the expense of others. That's what we mean by not neutral. Number 4, power and rules interact. So what that means is that social rules tend to be stable when they confer power on the people they benefit. So when the people who are the beneficiaries of rules have some advantage that flows from the presence and operation of those rules tend to be defended. Those rules tend to be embraced and promoted, right? So rules will be stable when their beneficiaries get power from the existence of those rules. Rules can also be inconsistent. This is the 5th aspect of rules to keep in mind. What that means is that some rules can contradict other rules. Again, some laws might contradict other laws, but more often than not, norms and other norms are going to be somewhat inconsistent. And then the 6th aspect of rules to keep in mind is that rules can change. They can occur via a very quick sort of process of contestation. We overturn a set of rules and replace them with a new set of rules, or it can reflect gradual change, right? So over time, rules can change, as they no longer fit the present moment. Again, if we understand how rules operate and we can discern those rules and see them at work within society, it becomes easier for us to take that into consideration as we sort to build and frame our analysis of how that society operates. So rules aren't the only thing we need to understand. We also want to understand sort of the nature of the place that we're trying to study or make sense of. But keep in mind that the point about rules is always going to be applicable. Some of the things that we also want to keep in mind, some of the basic concepts that will be sort of present in our class this semester, are things like place and space. One of the themes that is explored in this class is the impact of where and how Americans live. This is why you're reading a number of pieces by Mashonis and Perillo, who do an analysis of urban life and suburban life and sort of looking at the structure of where and how we live and how that shapes potentially the emergence or the operation of social problems. So when we talk about place, we're talking about the physical or virtual location where people gather and interact. Space, on the other hand, specifically what we call social space, are the meanings, the socially constructed meanings that get attached to the place. And those meanings have the effect of shaping the activities that occur there. So a city might be a place, but a neighborhood or even a city block might be a space, right? Because the people in that immediate environment, right, they have neighbors, they have a sense of attachment. They might have all gone to the same school, or their kids may all go to the same schools. They may frequent the same restaurants and coffee shops in the neighborhood, right? So that sense of attachment, that sense of connection to a geographical place is what transforms that place into space. So you can have, interestingly enough, you can have place without space. But of course, it is impossible to have space in the absence of place. And we're going to look at what happens. One of the things we'll look at is what happens when people are either connected to or not connected to the places in which they live. All right, what kind of society is America? Remember I said in one of the previous videos that accurate descriptions of society are really, really important if we are going to actually conduct any sort of analysis. So descriptions of America, accurate, clear descriptions of America are really, really important. They're a starting point. They're not the end, but they are a necessary element of the beginning. So I'm going to kind of just run down a couple of quick descriptors of American society, and these things will be brought back into the conversation over the course of the semester. But it's helpful if you keep in mind somewhere in your kind of conceptual toolkit that all of these things about American society are in fact true, whether you're aware of it or not, right? So, we tend to have a very contextual and sort of limited sense of the broader society around us unless we're specifically attuned to looking, more broadly. So some of these things might fit with what you think you know about America. Some of them may seem a little bit inconsistent with the version of the country that lives in your mind. But I assure you that there's good, solid empirical data behind each of these assertions, and we are going to get into a lot of them over the course of the semester. First thing to keep in mind is that the United States is a technologically advanced industrial society. I think this one should go without saying, but there are some people who still sort of think of America as a nation that has its roots in and still in many ways is connected to farmers and people who live, in remote, rural, and heartland kind of conditions. But we're advanced, we're industrial, we're significantly urban, which I'll talk about a little bit more in a bit. But we are an advanced industrial society, and that's a good starting place. The United States economy is a capitalist economy. The capitalism of the now early 21st century is obviously a little different than the capitalism of the late 19th century, but nevertheless, in spite of some government regulation and some programs that are designed to ameliorate some of the effects of market economies, the United States is still very much a capitalist economy. U.S. capitalism is dominated by very large firms and corporations. So we have a tremendous number of small businesses and medium-sized businesses in this country, but the economy itself is dominated by the operation of these very large firms. The United States has very low union density. Union density just refers to the percentage of the labor force that is represented by unions. In the United States, I've got data for 2014. Obviously, it's a little dated now, but it hasn't changed that much. In 2014, about 10.7% of the U.S. labor force was represented by a union. That includes both public sector and private sector workers. The comparisons that we're going to make in this country are to an organization called the OECD. I'll talk more about that over the coming weeks. But the OECD, that just stands for the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. It's the 36 or 37. I'm not entirely. I think it's 36 or 37 member nations that are like the United States. So when we make comparisons of the United States to other countries, we want to make what are kind of apples to apples comparisons, right? We don't want to compare apples and oranges because those are very different things. But if we compare apples to apples, then it becomes possible for us to evaluate, an apple relative to what apples are what other apples are like. So these 36 or 37 other countries that make up the OECD, when we look at them, those are our peer nations. Those are the nations that it makes the most sense to compare the United States to because they are the most like the United States. So whereas the United States has a 10.7% proportion of its labor force represented by a union in 2014, the average for the OECD in that same year was 16.7%, right? So we are below average when it comes to union density. The United States economy is weakly regulated. It's weakly regulated in two ways. And I mean weak as in not strong, not weak as in, there are regulations that roll out every 7 days. When I talk about weak regulations, what I mean is that there are relatively few limits on businesses and corporations in America, in spite of what people might think, in spite of what politicians might tell us. Compared to other countries that are like the United States, we have really, really weak regulations on the books. We also have really, really weak mechanisms for enforcing what rules there are on the books. So it's weakly regulated both in terms of enforcement, but also in terms of the rules and restrictions that are placed on businesses in the first place. The United States is integrated into a global economic system. Transnational capitalism and the flow of raw materials and goods and services across national boundaries is vibrant and thriving, and it's happening everywhere, and we are deeply intertwined into that global system. We are not an island. It's very, very hard for the United States to take what we would call an isolationist position in any meaningful sense, because we are sort of woven into our economic practices, our firms and corporations will do, for example, the extraction of raw materials in other countries, and they'll do manufacturing in other places where labor costs are lower than in the United States, and then those things are brought back to the United States where they're sold in markets around the country. So deeply intertwined into a global economic system. In terms of inequality, the United States is the second highest country among all of the OECD nations in terms of inequality. Poverty is the second highest among all the OECD countries. We're a very wealthy country, don't get me wrong, but the degree to which that wealth is equitably distributed within the population, we're not particularly good at that. We generate a tremendous amount of wealth, but it's for a relatively small number of people and a relatively small proportion of the population. U.S. political institutions are liberal democratic. Now, that doesn't mean there aren't conservatives, and it doesn't mean there aren't Republicans. But when I say liberal democratic, I'm not talking about political party affiliation. I'm talking about sort of, again, classical liberalism, rights of individuals, enshrined in governing documents and operating principles. Right, sort of what we think of, and we think of the founders of this country. They were liberal and they were democratic, not liberal Democrats in the 21st century sense of the term, but they were liberal and they were democratic. And our political institutions, as a result of that, are organized around those principles. The United States is heavily militarized, and we maintain a global empire. Now, it looks different than the way that empires looked in the 1800s and the early 1900s, where imperial powers like Britain would basically set up proxy governments all around the world. They directly kind of managed India. They directly kind of managed other countries in the Commonwealth. The way that empire works in the late 20th and now the early 21st century is a little bit different, but primarily it's done through the projection or the ability to project military power to control shipping lanes and to control for geopolitical stability, which is at the end of the day something that's vastly beneficial to these transnational capitalist interests, right? A world at war, or a world in which tensions are constantly boiling over, is a place that's generally speaking pretty bad for business. So the U.S. uses its military empire to kind of create as much stability in the world as possible for commerce and trade. The United States internally is patriarchal, and it's divided pretty significantly along racial and ethnic lines. I don't think that should come as a surprise to anyone. The United States culture itself is pluralistic. That means there is not a homogeneous or unified American culture, but rather multiple cultures that make up the United States. A kind of patchwork of diverse cultures. The culture is also highly individualistic. Features, as I mentioned, high levels of religiosity. Commercialism and consumerism are kind of rampant in American society. They're pretty much everywhere. And finally, the United States is a very violent and very repressive society. And not surprisingly, that becomes the source of a lot of social problems. It is also, interestingly enough, partially a reaction to the presence of a lot of social problems. So we're going to kind of explore all of these things, but I think it's very helpful from the onset or the outset, I should say, that we have a clear understanding of the kind of society that we're going to be looking at, that we're going to be trying to understand. Social values. Let's talk a little bit about dominant American social values. I think that there are 5 dominant American social values that are not necessarily universally shared, but are pretty widely shared within the country. There are other values. I don't want to suggest that this is an exhaustive list, but these are the dominant values. They are freedom, prosperity, efficiency, fairness, and democracy. When we think of the sort of the cultural side of the United States, as opposed to the sort of the material and structural side of the United States, we think about the cultural side and we look at the values that are shared across significant portions of the population. I think these 5 are fairly prominent. Freedom. And again, we're going to talk about all of these things as the semester rolls along. But freedom, generally speaking, is the idea that people should be free to live their lives to the greatest degree as possible, as they wish. Right. So I get to live my life with little interference from other people, from government, from community, from society at large. Prosperity is the idea that an economy should generate a high standard of living for most people. That is something that most Americans believe, even if it doesn't actually show up, even if that's not actually what we do. There's a strong commitment to the idea that is what should be. Same with efficiency, right? The efficiency argument is the idea that the economy should generate rational outcomes, kind of effectively balancing costs and benefits. We should get that prosperity. We should get that that American dream for as many people as possible, while minimizing the cost of doing so, right? So that notion of efficiency is really, really important, and can sometimes one of the things you'll see is that some of these values can clearly impinge on some of these other values. Fairness is the idea that people should be treated justly and that they should have equal opportunity. That's also a fairly well-established American cultural value. And then the last one, of course, is democracy, which is the idea that our public decisions, not our private decisions, right, but our public decisions, should reflect the collective will of equal citizens. So in a democracy, right, the governing bodies reflect the consent of the governed. And those are, again, the dominant social values that define U.S. society. Just so everyone's clear, right, a value is an idea about something that is important or good or desirable. The values themselves are abstract. They reside in our minds. They are learned from the culture around us through a process of socialization and reinforcement. But what happens, of course, is that the presence of these values lead to patterns of behavior, and the patterns of behavior are what we call norms or rules or laws. Right? Those presumably reflect the underlying values. A really simple example is in our culture, we might put a premium, or we might value gratitude. Nobody really knows that you feel gratitude because it's a feeling. But the things you do when somebody does something nice for you, when somebody makes a gesture, when somebody buys you a gift, for example, is that you express that gratitude by saying thank you. Right? The saying of the words thank you is a way to express a value that you hold in your mind. the evidence for the value is the norm, right? So we look at the behaviors, we look at the norms, we look at the rules, we look at the structures, and we ask ourselves, to what degree do they reflect the underlying values? And then we can use those values and the norms that are presumably a reflection of those values to gauge whether or not the country is in fact sort of living up to its values. There are disagreements about values, and this is where I'll leave you guys, but there are 4 ways in which people disagree about values. Generally, there are probably others, but I think there are 4 main ways in which people tend to disagree about these things, where we see points of friction. The first set of disagreements about values are over what we actually mean by this, right? When we say democracy, when we say freedom, when we say prosperity, what do we really mean by that? And some people have one idea about what those things mean. Other people might have a different idea. And it's that contestation that represents one of the sticking points, one of the friction points when it comes to creating some kind of consensus about what we mean by these values. Second kind of disagreement about values has to do with assessing the actual performance of our institutions in delivering on those values, right? So when we look at the institutions, we look at the structures of American society, and we ask ourselves, are these things actually promoting freedom? Are they actually promoting democracy? Are these things creating fairness or operating with the principle of generating prosperity? A third kind of disagreement about values has to do with the relative priority of values, which ones are more important than others. If it comes down to a choice, do we favor freedom or do we favor democracy? Do we favor fairness or do we favor prosperity, right? So that is another place in which people can disagree about values. And then finally, of course, there's a lot of disagreement about how things can be improved overall. If we assume that there's broad consensus that the United States values democracy, and then we assess the degree to which America is actually a sort of functioning democratic society, and we find it wanting in some way, we can have some disagreements about how much or even if it's possible to improve on the current operation of a particular given social value, like, say, for example, democracy or freedom. So those are things to keep in mind. And one of the themes that will kind of be running throughout the course of this semester will be, the degree to which these values shape the definition of and the operation of social problems. And in other cases, the degree to which social problems themselves are reflections of the inability or diminished ability to sort of deliver on these values. So values and the cultural side of things will be important. We're going to mostly obviously be focusing on the operation of structures because as sociologists that tends to be where our bias is. But I think it's important to keep the values and the cultural side of the equation in mind because both culture and social structure are the two things that give rise to social organization, which is the thing that sociology is really interested in understanding anyway, which is the idea that we want to understand how the society comes to look the way it looks. How does it work? How does it really work? And for what reasons does it work this way? And if we can't answer that question, if we can't really grapple with that question, then we can't really address the third question, which is how do we improve society? How do we address social problems in a way that leads to, again, an improving set of conditions for the greatest possible number of people. All right, so that brings us to a conclusion here. So until the next time, I'll say take care.